you much, sir.
Thank you.
I am bulletproof, the last 4 months of a 5th Corps soldier. I found the letter collection of this interesting gentleman at the Huntington Library, which is a long way from here. But I want to toot the horn of the Huntington Library before I do anything, because they saved this guy's 200 letters, and without people saving the letters, we'd never even know about this guy. So I will praise the Huntington Library for a second. First, it is in San Marino, California, which is in Los Angeles County, a little east of Pasadena. It's very strange for two people who are in northern New Hampshire who live in a county with 32,000 people in it to be in LA County that has 11 million. So it was a shock for us, but it was a great trip, well worth it. The Huntington Library was founded by Henry Huntington in the early 20th century. He was a very fascinating individual. He collected just about everything. He was pretty much a Renaissance man, botany, art, books, and everything. And his collections became the Huntington Library and their beautiful gardens, their beautiful art gallery. They advertise themselves as one of the world's great independent research libraries, and I can tell you, no one will ever be able to successfully sue them for false advertising. They have 12 million items that cover 1,100 years, so if you want to spend your life studying the last millennium, you can hang out at the Huntington Library. And I was really impressed. They have a massive amount of Civil War collections, and I think a part of it is a lot of Civil War veterans retired in California, and Henry Huntington and other people collected those, and they've saved them to this day, and it's very fortunate they did. Kevin mentioned my interest in good old Fighting Joe. There's 18 boxes of the Joseph Hooker military papers there. There's a fair number of that's in the official records, but there's some gems that are not. So any understanding of Hooker, you really need to look at those boxes a little bit. We spent some time looking at them. There are many other excellent collections. There's a fantastic collection, also about 200 letters from a guy in the 1st Vermont Brigade, George Mellish, fantastic letters. He was a wonderful writer. And I really latched on to the Joseph Collingwood papers. He was the original captain of Company H of the 18th Massachusetts. And it seems like almost every day he was writing his wife. And there are over 200 letters in his collection. So here's a little bit about the star of the show tonight, Captain Joseph Walworth Collingwood. As you can see, he was a little bit older than the average Civil War soldier. He was 40 years old here at Antietam, born on the island of Nantucket, and he naturally loved the water. He spent much of his life in Plymouth. He was a commercial fisherman, and he operated a market. And he just lived a normal life there through the years, got some militia experience, got married, had 5 kids. Many of them lived long lives, unlike their dad. And his militia experience came in the 3rd Regiment, so he used those connections to become an officer at the start of the Civil War. So he was the original captain of Company H of the 18th Massachusetts. A little bit about the regiment, mainly recruited in the summer of 1861, so sort of the second wave of recruitment in 1861. And what's interesting too, a lot of times you think a regiment with 10 companies, they all recruit at the same time and they all come together and muster in at the same time, but the 18th Massachusetts, like a lot of other regiments, they only had 8 companies when they were called to Washington. So they were still working on getting a couple of the companies together. So 8 companies went to Washington and arrived in late August of 1861, and the other 2 companies joined a little later. They were connected with good old Fitz-John Porter early in their experience. They spent much of the first winter of the war around Halls Hill, Virginia, just across the Potomac. And they went to the peninsula with Porter and his division, which was originally part of the 3rd Corps, when the 3rd Corps was formed in March of 1862. And then McClellan, when he was given discretion to form more infantry corps and reorganize the army on the peninsula, the 5th Corps was formed on a provisional basis, and his division became an original part of his corps, the 5th Corps. Somehow, the 18th Massachusetts lucked out on the peninsula. They were on detached duty, they were guarding White House Landing, so they didn't spend a whole lot of time encamped around Gaines Mill, so they missed most of the fighting of the 7 days. So they didn't really get to know the war too well, except in retreat down the peninsula, because they weren't really engaged much at all in the fighting there. And the 5th Corps suffered about 7,500 casualties in a week there at the 7 days, and the 18th Massachusetts was busy destroying the supply base at White House Landing before they also started the retreat. But their vacation from war ended very rapidly in the Second Bull Run campaign, and the regiment's worst day of the war occurred there, as this table will illustrate. Based on the post-war state roster by company, there's just the killed and mortally wounded in the 18th Massachusetts in one afternoon. They suffered 55 combat deaths in the attack along the railroad cut there at Second Bull Run. That's about 45% of the regiment's battle dead across 3 years was a couple hours. And that sort of introduced the horror of war to these men in a very profound way. Pretty much a year to the day after they arrived in Washington was their worst day of the war. And of course, that was just before the momentous decision by Robert E. Lee to invade Maryland. But the 1st Division of the 5th Corps, the division that Collingwood was in, did not join the field army at the start of the advance. So they were supposedly resting. And as you can see, the 10 letters from September that sort of form the bulk of my discussion here show him in Virginia. And they wouldn't leave Virginia until even a few days after his September 9th letter. So they sort of spent a little time walking around a few places in Virginia. And then, of course, there's a big gap there during the momentous time when they were getting ready to march and then marching to Sharpsburg. And then close out his letters there with a few more from the Sharpsburg area later in September. And I really enjoyed his September letters. They just showed a man he's deeply philosophical, and he's also feeling the burdens of the war very intensely. And so his September letters were very, very interesting to me. And he thought a lot in early September about the month that had just passed. And there were about 3 weeks that passed between their departure from the peninsula, their horribly difficult march through Virginia that ended at Second Bull Run, and then their arrival in Centerville, where he wrote his September 1st letter. And he noted the diet during this time that they were leaving the peninsula was tack, as hardtack was called, coffee, and what we could steal on the way. So that's sort of what he ate there for a while. And the horribly impactful attack that occurred on August 30th was very much on his mind in September. And he wrote some really interesting sentences about that. The 18th Massachusetts was basically right in the middle of the front line of Porter's assault. The ground was literally plowed up with the storm of lead and iron. That sentence really stood out to me. And he thought too a lot about missing friends. When the brigade formed in the early fall of 1861, there were about 5,000 men present for duty. And at Centerville, in early September, they had 1,100. So even missing a good chunk of the action on the peninsula, the 18th Massachusetts experienced the terrible horror of war there in the summer of 1862. And he mentioned many times specific friends that were gone. Many wounded, many killed. He was good friends of the Robbins brothers, John and Joseph. One was killed and one was seriously wounded at Second Bull Run. So these men were on his mind, and how hard the war hit them in the summer of 1862 was very much on his mind. So this was from his September 7th letter. So again, before the men were marching into Maryland. And this is from that letter. We have had a hard campaign. 1 month longer, and the Corps would be no more. I could not help as I saw the new regiments marching off for active service today, pitying them. They know not where they are going, but we do. We remember 6 months ago when we marched away full of hope and ambition, all eager to serve their country. And here we are, back again. But many a brave fellow lays under the soil of Virginia. We miss our friends and comrades as we gather around the campfires at night. War is a sad thing, but I had rather stay here for years and fight it out than to have our boys fight it over again. So that's sort of the mindset of a great patriot as he's resting in Northern Virginia just before he starts marching into Maryland. And I don't think you can read this. It wasn't so much to read the letter, but that's a photograph from his September 7th letter. And it's just, even from a distance and not being able to read it, you can just see that the handwriting is just so fascinating, and to know that, that frazzled warrior was sitting there in Northern Virginia writing that letter to his wife and talking about how horrible the life had become for his comrades in his company and in the regiment as a whole. So it's interesting, they were given a break essentially, so they weren't required to join the field army that was starting in the march against Lee. So you'd think they were just sitting around camp not doing anything and resting, but for whatever reason, the Army decided that these resting men needed to move between forts and do a march here and a march there. And in his September 9th letter, he just said the men had endured the dustiest march we have ever had, which is saying a lot because they ate a lot of dust the month before in Virginia. And he wrote some really fascinating sentences as he looked back on Second Bull Run and the terrible catastrophe that had been. We have seen the rough side of the elephant, which is the elephant. I'm always fascinated when combat is always referred to as the elephant. That's always an interesting phrase. We are completely played out. And that sort of expresses why some men were left in the Washington fortifications and didn't join the field army. Of course, there were a lot of guys who were played out who were already marching into Maryland. But the 1st Division of the 5th Corps was able to rest for a few days before they had to get going. Like a lot of other 5th Corps guys, Collingwood was a big fan of Porter and of McClellan. And he thought that one of the main reasons for the catastrophe that occurred in August was that McClellan was sort of stripped of his command. When Mac was thrown overboard, our cause was lost, he wrote. And he refers to him as Mac a lot, like he's, a first name basis with a good old buddy, but he's talking about the highest ranking officer in the Army with his nickname there. But even though he wrote about how he pitied the guys who were going into Maryland because they didn't know what they were running into, he also sort of had this renewed optimism, just knowing the Army was going after Lee and knowing that, seeing all these Union men marching into Maryland after having gone through the Peninsula Campaign or other terrible things, the Second Bull Run campaign, he still, he saw the vigor of the Northern cause, even though he was feeling quite wiped out himself. And he was very impressed with the fortifications around Washington. And he knew that although they were sort of resting, that all those fortifications were probably one of the main reasons why Lee decided to go into Maryland, because he knew Washington was not going to be attacked with how well protected it was. And then they march into Sharpsburg. As you know, McClellan was calling for more troops, and he certainly wanted to see the 5th Corps with him. More of the 5th Corps, the regular division, was already with the main field army, but the 1st Division was released. And so Collingwood and his comrades started marching into Maryland. And like virtually every other Northern soldier who wrote a letter or wrote in a diary in September, he wrote how wonderful Maryland is. What a beautiful place it is. And the hills, the scenery, the lush nature of the land compared to Virginia impressed the 75,000 Union soldiers who were in Maryland compared to Virginia. And Collingwood also saw that and very much appreciated it. So at Antietam, they arrived in time, but they were not directly committed to the battle. But they were very much in sight and sound of America's bloodiest day. The roar of cannon and musketry was deafening, he wrote in a letter just after the battle. And he also wrote a little summary and just another quick reading about the fighting at Antietam that he did not directly participate in. He was in reserve, but he very much knew much about, just from hearing and seeing. We fought a terrific battle and got the best of it, driving them at all points, capturing many prisoners and guns. Our troops fought splendidly. The ground is covered with dead. I am well. Troops are pouring in very fast. The rebels fight desperate. Porter says he's going to lead his old division in the last grand charge. I was on picket last night, took 2 rebels prisoner this morning. They came inside our lines. Love from your affectionate husband. You never want to forget that when you're writing a letter to your wife, right? You've just seen 23,000 men fall, but you don't want to forget that you like your wife. So while they were in reserve at Antietam, they were in a good position to sort of check out what was going on afterwards. And when Lee started his withdrawal, the 1st Division of the 5th Corps and Collingwood were sort of some of the first men to check things out. And it didn't work out that well. It started well on the evening of the 19th, capturing some cannon and sort of getting the best of it there, but the next day was a miniature catastrophe, especially for Collingwood's brigade. It was very near to being another Ball's Bluff affair, he wrote in one of his letters. And the regiment, the 18th Massachusetts, crossed in with the brigade, and they were sort of leading the charge of the brigade across the river. And although it was bad enough for the 18th Massachusetts, the day was way worse for the 118th Pennsylvania. About 45% of battle dead for the war for the 18th Massachusetts at Second Bull Run, 50% of the battle dead for the 118th Pennsylvania, just on the other side of the river here, just a couple miles away in Shepherdstown, which was still technically Virginia at the time. But Collingwood was very impressed with that new regiment, and he called them a bully regiment for the horrors they endured and the tremendous sacrifice. Almost 80, I think, killed or mortally wounded in that regiment, and he saw it. He was there. And another thing, since I'm interested in the United States sharpshooters, I was pleased to see that he noted, like some other guys there, the importance of the covering fire from the Maryland side there at the Battle of Shepherdstown. The 1st United States sharpshooters stood in the dried bed of the C&O Canal and were firing over to the other side to try to help the brigade get back across the river. And there are a few letters I've seen, and this was another one that said, gee, those sharpshooters were really cool, providing some covering fire for us as we were trying to get back. So there were 5 additional killed or mortally wounded in the 18th Massachusetts there. And afterwards, after the campaign was essentially over, this great philosopher that I come to respect so much, Captain Collingwood, wrote a few more letters. And again, he thought deeply about what everything meant and what he had seen. So he was pondering the campaign in his later letters in September. The great plan of the rebels has failed. It is the worst they ever undertook when they invaded Maryland. We have lost a great many men, but they have suffered terribly. I wish you could see some of the rebel soldiers. Take them together, they are the most dirty, ragged, miserable set of beings I ever saw. Still, they look hardy, and there is no question in regard to their bravery. What a pity we should slaughter one another. If the North and South were united, we might defy the world. And that letter just blew me away. It was so amazing. This man who could just write so well and absorb his surroundings so well and sort of point to a brighter future, perhaps, for the country later. If you've seen me give presentations before, you know how I like to put up Hal Jesperson maps. He's so great to work with, and he's wonderful. I've got a bunch of his maps in my 3 books, and he's doing more for Hooker, so it's always great to put up a Hal map. So this sort of shows this, and this is from the Sharpshooters book, so it's not totally specific to the 18th Massachusetts, but sort of shows you the Ford, Sharpsburg, the Antietam battlefield, sort of where the second sharpshooters were, and then in the old C&O Canal, where the first sharpshooters were. And it's just, this topography he puts in his maps and all sorts of stuff, he's just so wonderful. And if you've seen Civil War books, there's a really good chance Hal's got a map in it, because he's done so much work through the years, and he's great. So not only does it illustrate the positions of where the 18th Massachusetts was there after the Battle of Antietam, just across the river, but it also, lets you know how awesome Hal is, because his maps are so great. So I always like to toot Hal's horn a little bit. So that's just another great Hal map he did. The final weeks of Captain Collingwood's life were unfolding as Lee retreated back into Virginia. The whole brigade, Barnes's brigade, went on picket, starting right after the Battle of Shepherdstown, running through the morning of September 22nd. So they were posted, I do believe some of them did cross back over in the river, but they were also looking at the Maryland side of the river as well. And again, he just had the ability to use a sentence to so distill life and the difficulties of life. This was another one I liked a lot. A piece of pork we consider a great luxury. And that sentence can sum up how horrible the Civil War was for men in the field, even when they weren't fighting, because they were having a hard time finding things to eat. He received a promotion in October, and his October letters, and he has a bunch of those as well, in addition to ones from September, are mainly from Keedysville. And he was named the provost marshal of the town for some time. So he had a sort of a higher position, if you would, than just a company commander in the few weeks after Antietam. And he would go back to his regiment just as they were starting to march once again into Virginia, where they knew that there would be more battle. And he was there leading his company that he had led for so long below Mary's Heights at Fredericksburg when he received a mortal wound on December 13th, 1862, and he died on Christmas Eve. And the 18th Massachusetts added to its toll of woe and suffering with 24 total killed and mortally wounded. Later in the day, they were sort of part of one of the last waves of attacks below Mary's Heights. And in this time period where I sort of focused on Collingwood's letters in this 4 months from Second Bull Run through Fredericksburg, 70% of the men they lost to battle wounds fell in that time from Second Bull Run through Fredericksburg. And he's buried in a town he knew very well, Plymouth, Massachusetts, on the coast there, south of Boston. And like so many other families, this family lost multiple brothers in the Civil War. He had a brother in the 29th Massachusetts who went west with Burnside in the 9th Corps in 1863, and his brother died of typhoid fever in Cincinnati that summer. So it was a terrible toll just in one family. And again, the collection of letters are so impressive, but some of the last letters in it really are interesting. And whenever I do a presentation or a chapter title, a lot of times I try to work in a quote or a phrase from a soldier. And my title tonight, I Am Bulletproof, comes from the last letter Joseph Collingwood ever wrote. We expect to have a terrible battle. I shall stake the right to go to the front, but you know I am bulletproof. So don't be anxious about me, because I am bound to be in the thickest of the fight. So I know from all his letters he wrote, he really loved his wife, but unfortunately the last letter he wrote to her had false information in it, because a bullet killed him the next day. And thankfully, there are some materials in the collection that he didn't write. And there's an absolutely wonderful letter from Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Hayes, who knew Collingwood very well, and he was the commanding officer of the 18th Massachusetts. And he wrote a letter to Collingwood's wife on Christmas Eve. Madam, it becomes my sad duty to inform you that your husband is no more. He died at the hospital today from the effects of his wounds. He was not conscious at the time of his death. The surgeon attempted to remove the ball, which had lodged near the spine, and soon after this operation, he expired. Day before yesterday, he seemed quite bright and improving. Our surgeon, Dr. Holbrook, who saw him then, had strong hope of his recovery, but since then, he gradually declined. I shall forward you his remains, and shall also send you his effects. I am surprised and shocked at this event. I thought he was going to recover. Be assured that I deeply sympathize with you in this dreadful affliction. Your husband's memory will be dear to me and to all his late companions. His virtues will afford a bright example to us all. His life was honorable, as was his death. He fell at the post of duty as becomes a patriot and a soldier. With the assurance of my sincere sympathy in this affliction, I remain very truly your friend, Joseph Hayes, Lieutenant Colonel Commanding. And that's the last letter in the Joseph Collingwood collection, and it is a letter about the death of Captain Collingwood. Back to you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Kevin.
Great. Yeah,
Thank you.